Welcome back to Mixing Up Success. Today's episode deep dive into one of the most foundational and misunderstood elements of baking and cooking, dough. I'm joined by my friend, collaborator, and resident food scientist, Michelle. Welcome, Michelle.
Thanks, Dani.
Michelle and I have been teaching together side by side in my kitchen for the past 3.5 years. Hard to believe it's been that long.
It blows my mind.
And one thing that we see over and over again is that people treat all dough the same. And then they wonder, why didn't this work? So today we're going to talk about bread dough, pasta dough, cookie dough, pastry dough, pie dough. Each one is built on different science, different ratios, and very different handling techniques. You can't rush them all. You can't mix them all the same, and you definitely can't expect the same results. Today, we're breaking down why not all dough is created equal, what's actually happening on a molecular level, and how understanding dough science can completely change the way you bake, cook, and troubleshoot in the kitchen. This episode is for the baker or home chef who wants to move beyond recipes and start baking and cooking with confidence. Welcome, Michelle.
Thanks, Dani. We're going to talk about all doughs except for the money kind of dough.
Wow.
I got a big dough.
That's for another episode. We're working on understanding that one.
I'm pretty sure I'm not going to be a guest on that episode.
You never know. You never know. Maybe you're going to inspire so much interest in doughs that it triggers us to explore the other kind of dough.
Yeah, well, I mean, you cover other kind of dough in the financial, how to run the financial side of the bakery business. So I'll leave it to you.
All right. That sounds fair. Well, let's start with the foundation of what is dough.
Dough is, where you take some sort of starch, flour, or what have you. What we're going to talk about is flour, fat, and some moisture, and some flavor, and you mix it all together, and then you use it to encapsulate your goodness, your dessert filling, or your pie, or you smother it in a sauce. That's Michelle's definition, not an official definition.
Ultimately, though, doughs are kind of about ratios of those things.
Yeah, exactly.
And when you alter the ratios, that's when you get very different results.
Yeah, and I would even add substitutions, right? And we've seen that in when people come in, they're gluten and they have some concerns with gluten, and they don't want to use a wheat-based flour, and we're trying to use substitutions, and it's not the same unless you work through the recipe and try different things.
Right. But it can be done.
It can be done.
And we've done it.
We have.
All right. So let's talk about gluten. Let's start there. That's a great starting point because it's kind of a key component to what holds doughs together or connects them, right?
Yeah, there's different kinds of, I think we talked about this in one of the previous podcasts about leavening.
Yes.
Different types of ways things rise. And one, it's all interconnected, right? Like, so when you're making bread or when you're making a pie dough, you're using the ingredients to be able to create something that you want at the end. So going back to gluten in itself is we're not wanting, in some recipes we want a lot of gluten and in other recipes we don't, right? So it depends on how tough we want things, how elastic we want things, which is why you don't need a lot of pie dough. You don't need with your hands, it for a very long time because you don't want to create toughness, create those gluten chains and those structures because you want the pie dough to be tender.
Right.
But for the pasta, you want a little bit of gluten because it's got to hold together, right? And create a little chewy bite when you're eating your noodles.
Right. Yeah. And so gluten is the structure and it's protein or tied to protein.
Tied to protein. Yes.
So can you talk about that and how just high level, why we have different types of flour and what the difference in those types of flour and ultimately gluten is?
Yeah. So each flour, and it also depends on where you are in the United States. Each type of flour is basically generally, I don't want any like flour millers to come after me on this. This is a general, but it's all based on the protein amount, right? So
Right.
bread flour has a higher protein, a pastry flour has less protein. It's that protein in combination with the starches that create gluten. There's a lot of other things that go on in there, and we're not going to get into this because this isn't a science class, but it really does make a difference. Dani and I create all of our recipes using all-purpose flour, which is the middle of the road, right? The flour millers, when they're creating an all-purpose flour, to go for the middle of the road. So if you're using it for a pastry dough, it'll work. It won't be the best, but it'll work. If you're using it for a bread dough, it'll work, but it won't be the best. So yeah, so if you want to get real crazy, you want to get like, if you're really into your sourdough loaves and it is consuming your life, you're going all Taylor Swift on this situation.
Yeah.
I would recommend stocking your pantry with bread flour, which has a higher percentage of protein.
Which ultimately means you're going to have more gluten formation.
Yes, more gluten formation. It's going to rise better. It's going to have more structure.
Awesome. Well, thanks for giving us that high level view.
Very high level.
Yeah, but I think that sometimes we forget or we just don't even know what the difference between an all-purpose flour, a bread flour, and a pastry flour might be.
Yeah.
And it has to do with those protein components that ultimately lead to gluten formation.
Yeah. To be honest with you, I stock my house with all-purpose.
Same. I do, my husband and I do make a lot of pizza.
Yes, you do.
Yeah. And we do keep bread flour on hand specifically for our pizza dough.
Yeah, that would be good. Family goes through waves. We go on this, we're not going to eat carbs wave. And so I don't buy bread. But then we'll like want something with bread and I'll make bread. And then I'll go, dang, I really wish I had some bread flour.
Right.
But then there's other times, most of the time it just sits in the cupboard and I keep thinking the weevils are going to get into it and it's going to go bad and make a mess.
Yeah.
And I'd rather just keep my all-purpose.
Yeah. So one of the things that I often think about and wonder about is when I'm thinking about like an artisan bread. So like, the sourdough crusty artisan, really crunch, but like tender inside, but it's got like big pockets, big holes. It's really, unique to each loaf. Versus my standard like sandwich bread that I'm going to slice and make sandwiches out of. It has tight pockets, consistent. It's a different. It doesn't have that crunchy tender, or it has that nice tender.
You can make it crunchy if you left it in the oven.
Sure, but can you just help me understand the difference between those two breads? I mean, they are drastically different.
Yeah.
But
same ingredients.
Yeah.
That's why I love food science.
All right. So let's dive into those. Artisan bread versus your standard sandwich white bread.
Well, they start with different types of doughs. Hence the dough rest. Hence the dough episode.
Topic of the day, doughs.
How many times can we say dough? Anyway, so the artisan bread is a much wetter, more moisture dough. And that's really for quick hydration of the flour, right?
Okay.
So you're really like throwing a lot at it. The big pockets. So the way you make artisan dough, right? Let's just like you put flour, salt, yeast, you and some warm water, you mix it all together, you let it rise. Sometimes people will knock it down and let it shape it into a loaf and let it rise again and then bake it, right? Mm-hmm. There's not a lot of work, right? Which is why
it's super easy.
Yeah. And some people don't even do the second rise. They just let it go in their crock, their
bread basket,
whatever, and then bake it. And like the steam inside the pot also helps create some leavening, right? So, but really what it is, those big air pockets are the yeast going to work, right? Mm-hmm. So what yeast do, they consume the carbohydrates in where they're at, and they produce carbon dioxide, right? Which creates the bubble, which makes things rise. High level, right? Yeah. When you're making, but that's why it's also like really crumbly, right? Or not crumbly, but like it falls apart when you're making a sandwich.
Yeah, it's not consistent in its structure.
Yeah, and like when you go to spread mayo over it or peanut butter, there's a big pocket, and then so sandwich dough or sandwich bread takes you do a lot of kneading, and rising and falling and rising and shaping and falling and like it's just this long process. And that's because it still does the same thing at the beginning, right? The yeast still do their thing, still create air pockets, but then you punch it down, right? You release and let all that escape, all the air, trapped air. Then it's less moisture, so it takes longer for everything to hydrate and come together and create all these. Then you're kneading it. By kneading it, you're creating more gluten, right? You're shaping it. You do that a couple more times. I think you tell me you do yours like 6 times or something crazy.
Well, I have this, like, it's just a sandwich roll that I like to make like steak sandwiches out of, but I can only do it on the weekend because it's a 3-hour process, and every 30 minutes I have to knead the dough.
Yeah. So every 30 minutes, you're letting all of that trapped gas escape. So you're creating more smaller bubbles.
Right.
At the end of the day.
And the end structure is that dough has a lot of little tiny pockets of air, and it's a much
smaller crumb is what we would call it.
Yeah, there you go.
Right. In the biz, it's a smaller crumb.
Right. So even within bread, doughs can be completely different.
Yeah. Same ingredients.
All right. So we've talked a little bit about bread doughs, hydration levels, and how that impacts the time ultimately in getting that dough ready. We talked about working the dough and gluten development. We talked about yeast. Can you just touch on other types of leavening? We don't just use yeast. There's sourdough, there's different things.
Well, sourdough is still yeast. It's just a specific type of lactic acid bacteria. So that's what is creating the sour taste. But the other types of leavening is baking powder, baking soda, right? Imagine your science project at home, and you're doing baking powder, baking soda, or vinegar. You're adding an acid to bases, and it creates a reaction, and boom, 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 it comes out of the volcano. That's basically what's happening inside of your quick breads. That's what's creating those little bubbles that get trapped within the dough. That's why banana bread it's still dense, but it still rises a little bit.
Banana bread a dough, though, or a batter?
That's a good question. I call it a dough, but
I don't know. I've never really thought about it until just now.
Can you make bread from a batter? Well, it's banana bread.
I don't know. We'll have to research that.
I'm gonna have to research
that.
We'll
put it in the notes. Follow up. I'm not sure. It's just occurred to me. Never thought about it before. But it does make me think about a lot of quick breads and how you don't work those doughs.
No.
You just whip them up and dump them in the pan, and away they go.
They still turn it into a loaf that you could slice.
Exactly.
So that's why I say it's a dough.
Interesting.
But maybe a dough is something you have to knead, or you have to.
We'll follow up in the notes on that section. All right, let's move on to a different type of dough that's completely different. Pasta dough. So tell us, why is pasta dough completely different?
Well, there's not much moisture. You're using 2 cups of flour. The recipes that we use in our classes is 2 cups of flour, 3 eggs, and some olive oil. That's it, right? Most of the time you're using 1/4 cup of moisture, whether it's milk or water or what have you. It's a much stiffer dough. It's harder to knead.
Yeah. I get my arm workouts in pasta classes.
Yes.
Kneading pasta dough because it's a really tough dough.
Yeah.
And it's hard to get it hydrated.
Yes.
But you don't want to overhydrate.
No.
Because then it doesn't work.
We make like an Italian type pasta in our classes. There are other pastas that around the world that use more moisture, but the one that we're specifically using in this example is pretty low.
So it doesn't have a lot of air in pasta.
No,
because you're not trying to get a rise.
Nope.
Okay. So what are you trying to achieve in a pasta dough?
Chewy, right? You want, not like overly chewy, but like when you bite into the noodle that has a little, it's firm but still gives, and you want it to be, a noodle. It's got to be noodly, Dani. Jeez.
All right. Well,
but yeah, what you're trying to do, you're not using any leavening, right? You're not trying to rise it. What you're trying to do is create a gluten structure to be able to withstand lamination through the pasta roller and create the long strands, right? Both by shaping and the starches themselves, and still hold together, not fall apart.
Right. Okay. So it's a dough, and it uses similar ingredients minus leavening.
Yep.
So therefore it kind of doesn't have the air. But when I need my bread dough versus my pasta dough, it's very different.
Yeah.
So talk about that for a minute and why it doesn't you can't just fold it over and
And
have it meld back together.
yeah. Yeah, that's a moisture, the moisture content. I mean, there's a lot of things that go into it, but at the end of the day, it's all about how wet it is. And I think the other thing is also hydration time, how much water you're trying to get, how much water is in what you're doing, and how fast the starches swell and create, these structures in it, basically.
Got it.
So bread dough has a lot more moisture, and you could see this if you're doing bread dough in like a KitchenAid mixer and you put it all together and it's all sticky on the side,
Yeah.
right? And it's all sticky on the edges. And then like the more you need the more the longer that it's in your KitchenAid, it starts coming away from the sides.
Yeah.
Right. Well, that's because the flour has absorbed more moisture, right?
Mhm.
So, and being coagulating and becoming a mass. So
Okay.
that's why that happens, right?
Yeah.
And that's when you're getting closer to the end.
But we don't put our pasta dough in our mixer because it's like a brick almost in there.
It is a brick. Don't do that. Your poor mixer.
Yeah. So we knead it by hand in our classes, and that's what we teach because it is
Yeah.
a completely different dough.
Well, like I mentioned, you're only using in our recipe. We have 2 cups of flour, 3 eggs, and some olive oil and salt. So you're only getting the moisture,
Mhm.
water molecules from the eggs. That's why it also in our classes I teach yeah, we use 3 eggs, but that's subject to change depending on the egg, right? If you're using
Right.
small eggs or large eggs, homegrown eggs, bought eggs, what time of year it is. I mean, there's so much because the moisture content of an egg
Varies.
vary. And I think it's like, what did I say the last time? It's like 70% or something of an egg is water, right? The
Yeah.
rest of it is proteins and, fats and lots of other things. But at the end of the day, the egg itself varies in sizes and varies in moisture content.
And
So
then also the age of the egg,
age of the egg. Yeah, that's a good point too.
right?
So sometimes it's so funny. I mean, we teach these pasta classes and like one pasta class, all the students, all of their doughs come together and it's like all of the stars have aligned and Dani and I don't have to help all that much. But then like 2 classes later, no one's is coming together and everybody's getting frustrated and I have to keep adding water. And it's like, I'm sorry, but that's the whole point of this is that you know how to do this and you can do this at home. And each time you do it is going to be a little bit different and you're just going to have to like go with the flow, right? And evaluate as you go and adjust accordingly.
So one of the things that I like to talk about is that dough is kind of somewhat of a system and not always like a perfect recipe because there are other components besides the ingredients on the recipe. So we just talked about like the age of your eggs, for example, could have a drastic impact on your pasta recipe. But there's environmental factors too that can impact the results. So I do like to think of doughs in terms of a holistic system.
Yeah, I know that when you're doing your cookies, you're much more precise. And we've talked about on previous episodes when you're scaling things up, small fractions add up to a lot. But when you're making just stuff at home, I don't know. I very rarely follow a recipe to the T because you just have to like understand what's happening and
Yeah.
why and adjust accordingly, right? Because there are so many factors.
Yeah, I think you and I teach a lot of our classes together for the home chef.
Yes.
The reality is the home chef is going to use what they have at their disposal and then they're going to look in their cupboard and figure out what can I do to solve this problem. And so understanding the things that are going to impact your doughs is really important.
Yeah.
All right. So jumping back really quick to pasta dough, the last thing I wanted to talk about is it does have a rest period, but we're not resting it to get that rise. Explain what's happening in that rest period.
Equal hydration throughout the dough ball.
Okay.
Boom. There's your answer.
Boom. You got to give it you got to give it time.
Yeah, and so what happens is like you've created some gluten, right? And so as it sits it relaxes a little bit. And you can feel that in the dough when you get done kneading it, it's hard, right? It's
Right.
firm, and then after it sits for a while, it's softer and gives a little bit more give when you touch it. And that's what is happening is the moisture is becoming equal throughout the dough ball, and the gluten is like relaxing a bit.
So we've talked about bread dough. We've talked about pasta dough. Let's talk about cookie dough, my
Hmm.
favorite.
I'll let you do that.
Well,
You're the queen of cookies.
I know, but you have all the science. Cookie dough, I think one thing that I always chuckle about is that when I was a kid, my grandma, every grandma makes chocolate chip cookies, right? They're like, oh, here's some chocolate chip cookies. And my grandma, she loved to bake and she loved to make chocolate chip cookies. But we had like this running joke because you could pick up her cookie, her chocolate chip cookie, and you could look through it and you could completely see through the cookie. But there were like big chocolate chunks,
Like a
there.
lace
But
cookie.
it was like a lace cookie.
Grandma's chocolate chip lace cookies.
Yeah. And I always think of that because I personally am a fan of your thick, gooey chocolate
Ooh.
chip cookie.
Yeah.
And there's so much variation in what you can create in just a chocolate chip cookie.
Yeah.
And it all comes down to what's happening with the dough.
Yeah, for sure.
So those are two extreme examples. So let's talk about the lace see-through chocolate chip cookie. What's happening in that dough?
I think there could be a couple things.
Okay.
What kind of fat she is using.
Sure.
My mom does the same thing. They're not, it doesn't sound as extreme as your grandma.
They were
And I'm
see-through.
really happy that my mom doesn't listen to this because it's technology. But her cookies are also flat because she uses Crisco and only Crisco, and it melts fast. Right. And she doesn't create, when she's creaming the sugar with the fat, she doesn't create a lot of air in the dough itself, which traps and when you're creaming it, you're doing a couple things. You're making the fat molecules smaller, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then surrounding the fat molecules with the flour, right? To make little tiny pockets and adding air. And so when you bake it, it all sets, the little fat pockets melt, right?
Right.
And then create like these little pockets throughout the cookie. So if she's using a lower melting fat, like vegetable oil, and then not creaming it, then it's going to be lace. It's going to be a lace cookie. And so basically it's just sugar that's keeping the whole thing together, like a caramel. It like crystallizes.
Yeah, it literally would be like crystallized caramel, like melted together,
Which is delicious.
holding the chocolate chips in place. Oh yeah, it tastes great.
Yeah.
And every time I have a cookie like that, it reminds me of my grandma.
Yeah. There's nothing wrong with that. But the point is that if you're craving like a delicious chocolate chip cookie, it
might not fit the bill.
Yeah, exactly.
So we talked about creaming a little bit and what's happening there in our dough. Let's talk about the flour component of cookie dough and what is happening in that structure, because depending on the amount, it can alter the structure too of the dough.
Yeah, you're not creating bread cookies, right? So we don't want gluten. We don't want to overmix things.
Right. So what will overmixing create? Overworking a cookie dough.
You're going to make little bread cookies.
Little bread cookies.
Which actually kind of sounds good.
Yeah, I mean, that could be a whole new thing.
No,
okay.
I want bread or I want cookies. No, that's what you're doing, right? Like you're creating gluten strands of gluten that create structure, ultimately create structure. The structure creates a more chewy, you end up leading towards something more bread-like.
Yeah.
Which is why you do this creaming fat sugar thing in cookie making, and then you add the flour until it's incorporated and you stop mixing, right?
And also why you mix the leavening and salt throughout the flour so that it gets all incorporated.
Yeah, you're creating the little poof of the cookie towards the end, right?
Right. So one thing I like to think about is that I always think it's funny how we can take multiple different like chocolate chip cookie recipes, and in our home when we're making them, we can yield similar results without meaning to. because
Say that again. What do you mean?
I mean that, like, if we're looking at chocolate chip cookies, there's slight alterations, right?
Yeah.
But we have habits in how we mix our doughs that impact the outcome. And so we can take similar, they have to be similar, they can't be drastically different recipes and have very similar outcomes because of how we mixed the dough. So I say that because I know of people that can, no matter what recipe I give them, create a thin, burnt
Cookie. Yeah, I mean, read the recipe on a Toll House
yeah,
morsel bag. Then go to your Betty Crocker cookbook. Then like your deli recipe.
yeah,
Which these recipes are all tested by like a bunch of people in some kitchen somewhere,
yeah.
for all sorts of different types of ovens and all sorts of different types of pans, and they're creating a recipe that's like basically any dummy can do is the way I look at it. But then they still can mess it up in the kitchen, right? And it's all
Yeah.
because like, are you using melted butter or softened butter? How did you soften the butter? Like, how long did you cream it? How much air is incorporated. How long did you bake it? When did you pull it out of the oven? There's so many more factors that go into it.
Yeah, and I think it's just really interesting to me because I can talk to people. I mean, people ask me in our classes like, "Why does this always happen to me?"
Yeah.
And ultimately it's not the recipe that I'm diving into. It's the mixing process of the dough.
Yeah. I also find when I talk to people, they cook it too long.
Yeah, or too hot or something. Or what they cook it on has a drastic impact
Oh,
in the outcome. So if you're cooking on dark pans with like no parchment or anything, that's going to be drastically different than a light pan.
yeah.
So that can have an impact. But I just think it's funny to think about because it is a dough and the process really does matter. And when you figure out those tweaks to the process is when you really understand what's happening.
Let me ask you, can you over cream?
Yes.
Okay, what happens then? This is
Well, then in my experience, I don't know all the science, you can add the science, but in my experience, when you overcream your butter and your sugar, you've warmed up your butter and now you're not working with a cold butter or a room temperature butter. You might be working with a hot kind of melted butter. Now that's completely altered the dough.
yeah, you've lost all the air.
Right. And you're going to end up with these flat, spread out cookies.
Yeah. I think this goes back to practice, practicing different and trying different things in your kitchen. What works for, cuz you may look at it and be like, "Oh, is that creamed enough?" And I may look at it and no, it needs more or needs less and you need to do what works for you.
I want to share really quick before we move on to pastry dough my most frustrating cookie experience where the cookies aren't rising, they're just baking flat. And I thought, I've overcreamed the butter, I've overdone something, I haven't mixed something correctly. And you know what it was? Can you guess?
Old leavening agents?
Yes, every time.
Oh my gosh,
Time.
that wasn't scripted at all.
No, every time. Check your leavening agent. Go buy a new leavening agent if something's not working. Because in cookie dough, I mean, at home, how often do you replace your baking powder, your baking sodas? They go bad and they don't work. And there is nothing more frustrating than not getting a dough to work because your leavening agent is old.
That's funny. You can test it,
Oh, right. Yeah, great. Talk about that.
Okay, it goes back to my volcano.
Yes.
Make a volcano in a bowl in your kitchen, or make the lava in the volcano
With some vinegar.
With some vinegar. Also, make sure vinegar's good.
That goes bad too.
That goes bad too. But yeah, just add a little bit, see how much fizzle happens. So that's also a great discussion if you're trying to teach your kids why we're doing this. When you're adding the acid in, the vinegar into the baking soda or baking powder, baking soda, it'll fizzle.
Right.
And you'll get to see, and that's what's happening in your cookies.
Yeah. Perfect. All right. Let's move on to pastry doughs. Let's talk about what we're doing different aside from bread, pasta. What's happening?
Lamination.
Lamination. lamination is the key in pastry dough.
Lamination.
So, what does that look like? How are we handling that dough different?
We are creating thin sheets, thin sheets of fat layered with flour, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I like to think of like if you've ever eaten phyllo dough or, it's really flaky, like
Yeah.
gets everywhere,
Mm-hmm.
right? When you're eating it, biting
Yeah.
into it. Well, that's because it's like very, very thin layers,
Right.
many, many thin layers, right? Just stacked on top of each other. And what happens is you've created these layers, the butter melts in thin sheets in between these layers, and that's what's creating
The flake.
the flake.
Got it. So, what's the difference when we talk about pie dough? Because it's slightly different in terms of that lamination layering.
Yeah, I mean, pie dough, I like flaky pie dough. I
Yeah.
think that's a good descriptor of a pie dough when you're eating it. But you don't want a sheet of flake. You want little flakes. And so that's why you're creating in a pie dough, you're making the crumb in a pie dough. You're laminating the butter or fat, whatever
Mm-hmm.
you're using, in smaller diameter pieces than you
Mm-hmm.
are for like if I
Like
feel
croissants or
or
something where you're just like creating
puff pastry,
sheets.
those other things, you're wanting wide sheets, long layers, that sort
Mm-hmm.
of stuff. So it's all about the size, the particular size.
All right. So, I want to talk about that because I think that's a great thing to think about when we're talking about pie dough. In my go to recipe, I like to use two different fats in combination together. And it's like a quarter cup of Crisco. And I like that because I feel like it creates a different size of pocket in my dough. And then I grate butter in to create these little tiny like specks of butter that create these other pockets. In my experience, the combination of the two together in the right ratio create an ideal flavor and flake.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. Is flavor is a huge part of what you're doing.
Yeah.
Also, they have two different melting points.
Yeah.
So when the dough's in the oven, one is gonna melt at a different time as the other.
Okay.
Right? There at the end of the day, is it like a drastic change? No. Is it like the butter melts in a minute and the Crisco melts in 2? No, but it is different, right?
So,
So as they're melting in there, it creates one layer, like the Crisco will melt first. Then the butter's still working on melting, right?
mhm.
Because it's also, you're putting it in cold, right? So it has to warm up, then it has to get to melting temperature
And a lot bigger chunks.
and a lot more. So it creates a
Mhm.
different type of pocket, right?
Okay.
So the Crisco's making small, little tiny pockets. The
Mhm.
butter's making bigger pockets, and that's why you get a variation of flakiness throughout your pie dough
Right.
or your crust.
So let me think about that just for a second because you made me think of something I haven't really spent a lot of time talking about. The different melting points of the fat, that can have a big impact on your pie itself because depending on the type of pie and how long it needs to bake in the oven, like I can like picture the Crisco burnt crust
Yeah.
because the center of the pie needed longer because of whatever fruit or whatever was in it.
Yeah.
But the crust really could not withstand being in the oven that long.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very good point.
Yeah.
That it also brings back fresh fruit pies versus canned fruit pie.
Yes.
Right.
Or pre cooking your filling.
That's a whole nother topic.
All right.
Of like not putting fresh apples or fresh
Yeah.
pears or peaches or whatever, because there's so much moisture. All that moisture is going to go into your pie dough and make it soggy.
Right.
So
Yeah.
you're affecting the shell,
Yes.
right? Because it's just going to sit in there. Unless you pre-bake your pie dough, for those types of pies. There are some out there, where you would like pre-bake it. So it's already created like a protective cover. I don't know how to
Yeah.
describe, it's already baked. So the moisture won't penetrate it as easily. But if you're doing fresh dough, fresh fruit, fresh everything, in my experience, you tend to have a not as stellar crust. It's
Right.
wet on the bottom
Right.
and falls apart when you cut it.
Right. Yeah. And it's usually great that way for the first serving, but it doesn't hold up that
Yeah, I
well.
mean, at the end of the day, if you're gonna, like, put a scoop of ice cream on it and serve it, it, like, doesn't matter. But if you're wanting to have, like, this blue ribbon pie that when you cut it, it comes out, like, with you can see the bottom crust intact and the bottom crust doesn't get stuck to the pan and,
Mhm.
you know, there's not a huge gap between the fruit and the top crusts.
Right. Two more quick things about pastry doughs. Oftentimes, you want to think about temperature controls while you're working with the dough because of the fats. And then also the amount of working of the dough
Yeah.
itself.
Don't wanna overwork. I mean, that's why, like, when you're making a puff pastry, you have to put it in the fridge after each time you layer because
Right.
you've warmed up the dough.
Right.
You warmed up the butter, starts melting, right? It's now not a sheet, it becomes incorporated with the 2,
Mhm.
flour-esque layers in between it, and it becomes one when we're wanting layers, distinctive layers.
Right. Well, that was a lot about doughs and a lot in a really short amount of time. So let's bring it back because I truly believe when you start to understand the differences in doughs and how you handle them and why you're using the ingredients, that's where you gain confidence in the
Yep.
kitchen. And understanding dough science can then help you troubleshoot,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And figure out why did this not work? What went wrong? You can understand some of the common mistakes. So, can you touch on just a handful of mistakes either you've made or you've seen people make that are common that we could try to avoid?
Just relating to doughs,
Yeah, doughs.
where to begin? I've had so many failed bread recipes in my life. Um,
Me too.
and I think that goes back to I do not ever follow a recipe. I mean, it's because like I'm a big fan of like using what you have in the kitchen. I think that many people struggle with that. I know of so many people who will not use a recipe if they do not have every single ingredient
Yeah.
and the measuring tool in which to measure. Right? I'm not like a good example is like this happened this winter. I'm not going to somebody that I know and close to me. I'm not going to make that pumpkin pie because I didn't have any nutmeg.
Oh,
And I was like, well, you can still make the pie. It just isn't going to have a nutmeg flavor.
yeah.
And they were like, no, I don't have nutmeg. And I was like, you don't have to.
Yeah.
It's okay. It's going to be okay. It's still going to taste like a pumpkin pie.
Yeah. And you're
It's
probably
got
going to put like
cinnamon and
whipped cream on it
yeah.
anyways. And it's going to be great.
And so it's like things like that, my point is it's okay to not have everything, especially if you understand why you're putting it in there in the first place.
Sure. There's the essential components that you need to have to make sure things happen. But ultimately, when you understand doughs, you can start to figure out what's going on, how to alter them, and how to substitute.
We touched on this earlier when you're starting to use alternative ingredients
Yep.
because you're gluten intolerant or you can't eat eggs or whatever your concern is. You have to understand. There's a good example. The last pasta class we had someone who wanted gluten-free pasta.
Yep.
We have in our on stock some alternative from Bob's Red Mill, right?
Yep.
All-purpose flour.
Just a
On the
1-to-1.
bag it says 1-to-1. Use this exactly like you would use flour. Well, you don't. Sorry, Bob's Red Mill. But
No.
in this case, it took so much more water to be able
Mhm.
to get that dough to come together. And the reason why is because they're using gum substitutions or other types of gums to
Mhm.
create the illusion of starches. It's not an illusion. To be an alternative that still has the same texture. Hydration of different gums varies versus starches. You have to like understand what you're doing with what ingredients.
Yeah. And then ultimately, like with that particular pasta dough, you have to handle it differently
Yeah.
because it will not. I mean, most gluten free pasta is not going to roll.
Because it doesn't create gluten.
It doesn't have the structure, right? So you end up having to hand roll and
Yeah.
hand cut noodles in that case. But you know what? It turned out and
Yeah.
it turned out well.
Oh, I was gonna say, well, just eat rice noodles. It's fine.
Yeah, there you go. There's a good alternative. Thank you, Michelle, for joining us today. It's always great to dive into some of the science of what's happening in our recipes and understand what's going on. I will be the first to admit I have had more dough failures than I probably could even remember. And at least once or twice a month, I still have a dough failure.
Yeah.
It happens.
I would encourage all the listeners to do some research and research what is gluten, all the things that we talked about, what is happening. There's some really great resources out there that help explain these things in a non-technical manner. And so you can really understand them for yourself.
Yeah. And you can learn a lot. Honestly, the best way to learn is to just try.
Yeah.
And just keep trying and don't give up.
Try it a different way each time, though.
My
Can't keep
hus-
trying the same way, Danny.
My husband and I have been making pizzas for 20 years, pizza dough. And I would say the first like solid 8 years were really rough. And had we leaned into a little bit more science, we probably could have shaved off quite a few years
Yeah.
in that experiment. But we learned a lot along the way.
Yeah.
So if this episode resonated with you and you realize you've been treating dough kind of all the same, you're not alone. And that's exactly why Michelle and I built our online dough focused courses. So feel free to check them out on our website at dannyskitchenshop.com because we dive into each of these types of doughs in different ways and help give you the foundational skills to be successful. So whether you're diving into bread, pasta, cookies, pastry, or pie, these courses are designed to help you bake with confidence and not just guess. Thanks for joining today, Michelle. It's always a pleasure to have you.
Thanks, Danny.